Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm the CEO and the co-founder of Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We have worked with pharma companies from across the globe over the past 14 years to help them with everything like virtual advisory boards, online medical education, ambassador programs, all these different things that have been very complicated and intricate to do since COVID and beyond, when you're trying to work with global affiliates, local operating companies, and customers from across the globe, bring people in, and oftentimes with people that you're not used to working with, like nurses, payers, allied healthcare providers, and even patients. So we enable that sort of thing through a series of touch points over what we call longitudinal expert engagement plans. And we help our companies to be able to work strategically and tactically with a variety of things and working with pharma companies. But more importantly at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with some of the leading edge thinkers, digital provocateurs, and some of the healthcare thought leaders, we can all work together to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. So I'm super excited about having one of these healthcare thought leaders at the table with me today. This is actually Kaitlin Anstett. She's currently a senior medical advisor at Theratechnologies. She's working with her HIV and AIDS portfolio. She actually graduated from the University of Toronto in 2013, and she completed her PhD in microbiology and immunology at McGill University in 2017. Kaitlin joined Novartis Canada in 2017 as a medical science liaison in immunology, prior to becoming a medical advisor in immunology franchise in 2021. And there she was responsible for things like chronic urticaria, psoriasis, as well as food allergy. As a medical advisor, her responsibilities include supporting clinical trial sites in Canada, engaging with key experts to build advocacy, as well as to gain very important insights. She's working with a strategy with Canadian and international colleagues, and she's also preparing for the successful launch of her new therapies. Welcome, Kaitlin. So happy to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I'm really happy to be here.
Absolutely. A really robust and fantastic and exciting background, Kaitlin. I know that I'm especially very interested and a really big promoter of women in STEM. I think it's very exciting, really proud of you, really proud to have you on the show. I was wondering, for other people who are interested in listening, I was wondering if you could go over a little bit about the career trajectory, how you ended up landing in the fantastic position you are in right now with Theratechnologies.
100%. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey, rather short journey, as you did share the years. I always you're reverse dating me because I feel I'm always a little bit conscious. That's my own thing about being somewhat young. But anyway, yeah, talked about my experience doing my doctorate degree at McGill University, and the lab that I was working in, doing my research there, was really focused in HIV science, specifically HIV drug resistance. And my supervisor at the time was actually really instrumental in some of the initial research and discoveries of the antiretrovirals that are used today to treat HIV infection. And the reason I mention that is because he had really great relationships with industry. And that's not always the case for researchers that sponsor doctorates. And this isn't a comment on any single institution. I actually think McGill did quite a good job, but it's a comment across institutions. Academic institutions don't necessarily always provide all those resources for connections to industry for their graduates. Sometimes it's seen as, the dark side. That's what we hear, going over to the dark side and going over to pharma. And so I was really lucky to be in that position that my supervisor, other collaborators in the lab really fostered those engagements with industry, made connections when it was possible. And there was also a lot of alumni from the lab itself who had gone on to work in the pharmaceutical industry. So it was really a viable option for me as soon as I started in my PhD, and something that I could work towards. So I had that exposure really young and a lot of good connections that, again, your average PhD student may not have. So I did have sort of a leg up in that way. And then it's funny talking about my leg up, but none of that helped specifically in getting my position at Novartis. I do a bit of mentoring with students who are looking to enter the pharmaceutical industry, and we talk about networking and all the different things that you can do. But for Novartis, it was a sort of cold call, if you will. I just saw the ad on Glassdoor, didn't know anybody there, wrote a cover letter, submitted my CV, and I try not to say that I got lucky because, luck is when preparation meets opportunity. So I was very prepared. And then there was this opportunity. Novartis had done a round of interviews for my position, didn't find anybody that they really fit with 100%. So then they cast a wider net. So in casting that wider net, they caught me. And so I was really prepared for that opportunity. So I'm trying not to say that I was lucky. Um, and then moving over to Theratechnologies again was really just this amazing opportunity. I wasn't looking to leave Novartis. I had such an amazing experience at Novartis Canada, amazing mentors, and such an ability to grow and develop over my 5 years there. But I received a message from a recruiter that said, remote US HIV medical advisor. And it is such a unique opportunity, even in this COVID world, to be able to get other market experience to experience in another country without having to relocate. And that was something that was really important to me for my development in this career. And it was bringing me home. It was bringing me back to HIV research. Not that I didn't love working in immunology, but it's really where my passion lies. And so it was just this amazing kind of marriage of my experience at Novartis and then also my experience in my PhD. So this is week 4 at Theratechnologies. So I'm still very much onboarding and very excited to be here.
Wow, what an exciting story. Short but very effective. And I'm also just curious, your chosen profession in the medical affairs space. A
Mhm.
lot of times when we think about pharmaceutical companies, a lot of us gravitate to understanding, the commercials that we'll see on primetime TV, and there's lots of marketing and what have you. And we oftentimes don't see the invisible part, which is really the medical component, sort of the clinical trials and that sort of thing. Curious, from moving from Novartis to Theratechnologies, have you seen an evolution of what medical affairs is doing? What's the role and the importance of the medical affairs role in the evolution of what we consider or what we think about a pharmaceutical company?
For sure. I think we can see that evolution over time within large companies, but I've definitely felt a shift or more of a visibility on sort of the inner workings moving from a large pharmaceutical company to a smaller biotech slash pharma company. In a large company, you do tend to be more siloed, just that's how they have to work. And so clinical operations and then medical affairs, clinical research, they do work together and they do talk to each other, but they're distinct functions. But in a small company, everybody sort of pitches in, everybody sort of lends a hand. So I've had much greater already sort of visibility and insight and even participation in things like clinical trial protocols and amendments, analyzing the research, analyzing the data, that sort of thing. And so I can see that evolution of medical affairs not only sort of breaking down those silos in a way, but also being sort of, and maybe I'm biased as I work in medical affairs, but we're kind of the Swiss Army knife in that we are trained on that sort of clinical data and research and understand that world, but also can help in the commercial and the marketing and understanding strategy. And so, really, medical affairs, I mean, is an essential function and can help and lend itself to all those other functions within a company, if
Yeah,
that makes sense.
yeah, absolutely. That's really, really well said. I'm also just curious about the various ways that you touch a brand, a pharmaceutical brand. So, again, moving from the Novartis to the Theratechnologies, where you're in a much larger, environment or much bigger opportunity. I was just curious about what your focus, what you have seen in the changes of working from a local operating company, so a specific affiliate, and now maybe working in the global or a central headquarters. How do you do the move, if you will, even psychologically, to a small market to a really large market? What are some of the things that you had to be prepared? What are the things that you don't know that you're having to learn? And what's that move from basically local to global?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I One of the biggest things moving from Canada to the US in terms of market is the US market is regulated differently than the Canadian market. And so working with different kinds of health authorities and I don't want to say restrictions, that's the first word that's coming to my mind, but the procedures that are in place. So that's one thing that I'm still having to learn. I've never interacted with FDA before, and the different requirements and all those different things on a medical function versus a commercial function versus, clinical research. So those are things that I'm learning, and have a fantastic team supporting me in learning all of that. So I'm very grateful. And then moving from it's interesting because the first part of your question was sort of related to how medical affairs can how we influence, how we support, and I really find medical affairs is kind of a grounding influence in a way. We are grounded in the science, we're grounded in the label, we're grounded in what the research says. And so we can be strategic. We can look into what our research might suggest and how that might be influential or how that might um, resonate well with different key stakeholders, not only speaking about physicians, but payers, advocates. But we really ground everything in the science. And that's not to say that other functions aren't grounded in science, but we are the experts. I always say we're the internal KOL. So when it comes to at Novartis, when it came to immunology and the specific brands I was working on, I was the internal KOL. And now at Thera, not maybe not quite yet the internal KOL, but I will be the internal KOL for the specific brand and molecule that I will be supporting. And so we're really there to provide that insight and provide that grounding. And I really love being in that role, being that expert and providing that insight that you know, only medical can do. It's something that we used to say. There are things that only medical can do, and we need to empower medical affairs to be strategic and do those things that only medical can do.
You have made some interesting transitions in your role during a very precarious time in everybody's life, which is this COVID pandemic, which is evolving and slowly transitioning. And you were in different roles, and it's really an interesting place that you're in, being in immunology and then moving into HIV/AIDS in this environment of increased acuity to all things infectious disease.
Mhm.
And what does this mean from a global standpoint? And so many different layers to this, everything from supply chain to how this is affecting the world. And you're thinking about HIV and AIDS, and then also other, countries that perhaps can't afford it, and where there's imminent things like drought and famine and other sorts of things. I'm curious as to your personal thoughts on the HIV, AIDS, and pandemic in light of what's happened with COVID. What is the long-term plan, you think, or the insights of either A, what you've learned from the COVID-19 pandemic and how you may apply it to plans for HIV? And is there going to be an evolution in general about how companies invest, if you will, in infectious diseases in general?
Yeah, I think, oh goodness, there's so many things to sort of pick on there. One thing in terms of one supply chains, but also our healthcare system. I think COVID-19 really dramatically exposed how precarious healthcare systems, even in sort of what we would say with the Western world, the developed world, although don't really like that term, but you know what I mean. They really in this setting, our healthcare systems were very susceptible to disruption, and it it just highlighted how unstable and untenable our current system could be. And so when we talk about supply chain, when we talk about the healthcare system, I think there's definite learnings from the COVID-19 pandemic about where the cracks in the systems are and how we need to fundamentally either intervene or even change the way that our systems operate. Now, I'm not um, that's not really related to my expertise in my role. That's just more of an observation. Um, and then, secondly, in terms of infectious disease, I think we kind of got a little complacent. In terms of being a virologist by training, I used to be a teaching assistant as well while I was at McGill. So I did teach undergraduates about virology as well. We would sort of kind of felt like we were standing at the podium talking to deaf ears about, we are due for a next global pandemic. There are all of these different signs that point to infectious diseases being able to affect humans more readily, such as global warming, when we have animal species that didn't used to interact together, interacting together now, and we have people living in higher population density, potentially with less access to hygiene and all these different resources. These are all, you know, worrying signs that infectious disease could spread much more quickly. So we could see that this was going to come, and we did see major companies looking into the avian flu, into Zika virus, into Ebola, but it was sort of a reactionary. Something would pop up and then we would investigate and try to come up instead of having a network of surveillance or even having large companies investing a lot in basic research into virology. But it's sort of a hindsight is 2020 kind of situation. So you never know what you don't know. So that's one aspect I would love to see, further investment in infectious disease. I think we will see that moving forward. And then the last thing that I'll say, having worked in the HIV space for a long time now, if I count or a relatively long time, if I count my PhD career, something that I really hope we see a shift in socially. Obviously, HIV remains a global pandemic, and it's also still highly stigmatized. The communities that are more susceptible to this infection and the individuals that do acquire this infection. I hope through the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had a lot of discussion about the morality of being infected versus uninfected, and people saying, I did everything right. I did everything that I could, and I still got infected. I hope we sort of breed a little bit more understanding about transmission of infectious disease and remove sort of that moral component to
Mm,
talking about people who do acquire infections and infectious disease. That's my hope
yeah.
coming out of this pandemic.
Beautifully, beautifully said. And I think, we could say a lot also about monkeypox and lots of other things that are
100%.
coming up about that as well, which is really interesting.
100%. 100%. Yeah.
You also alluded to the fact that the new virtual environment that all of us have in some ways been forced to work on, and many of us have wanting to adopt. We talk about this whole work from home concept, but it has provided you the opportunity to work in a global international position, working remotely, which is a really interesting, but sometimes potentially challenging situation. I'm curious as to the work from home thinking, some of the strategies and ideas, how that has worked for you, where some of the challenges are, and how you're integrating in a brand new company using a virtual format.
For sure. I think so. In March 2020, when everything shut down, I was a medical science liaison in MSL, and MSLs are generally home based. So we actually had a bit of an advantage, I think, over our peers who worked in offices together, in that we were already used to this virtual format. It evolved quite quickly. March 2020, we were still using Skype for business. Nothing wrong with Skype, but I think we see other tools for virtual conferencing that have certainly taken over the market, and but we were more adept at that. And what I actually found is that within pharmaceutical companies, just within the structure, the pandemic was quite democratizing because suddenly those people who were used to running over to somebody else's office or catching them at lunch or at the water cooler had to use these technologies as well to be able to contact their colleagues. And so it was actually, I felt like I had more of a window into the company, more of an insight, more of a voice, more visibility on everything that the company was doing because everybody was now working remotely. So I actually felt it was quite democratizing in that way. Um, and then, yeah, I'm very thankful for the shift to virtual technologies. In a way, the pandemic kind of forced us into something that we knew we had to adopt anyway. When we're speaking about sort of work from home and virtual work, there were individuals such as MSLs who were already doing it, but it wasn't largely adopted. And we see now the benefits that hybrid work offers to everyone, the flexibility in your schedule, um, and just the different accountings for different lifestyles and different life scenarios, which wasn't really there before or was there in a very limited scale. And so giving people freedom and allowing them to work in ways that work for them, I think this pandemic has shown actually improves productivity and improves the way that people engage with their work. And then from a sort of interaction standpoint and also a healthcare standpoint, I think it was we knew that virtual health could help in a lot of ways. People who have limited access to care. I'm based in Canada, and our northern region has a real paucity of healthcare professionals. So it actually increased the ability of those healthcare professionals that do work in the north to engage with their southern colleagues and collaborate and get more information. Also allows for patients to be able to engage more readily in care. And then for us as well as a medical affairs association or a pharmaceutical organization, it also broke down barriers for engaging with various KOLs. Again, not only with physicians, but with payers, with advocates, with pharmacy. It broke down a lot of barriers, and people seemed a lot more ready to engage again in these systems that already existed. We already had Zoom and we already had Skype and we've all always had cell phones and FaceTime, but it was never considered part of normal business operation. It kind of forced us into that. And I think that has been a really positive change. And now something that we need to sort of navigate is how we bring hybrid solutions into a, I'll say post-pandemic world. I'm waiting for the fall spike, but post-pandemic crisis, I'll say.
Yeah, well said, and beautifully explained in the evolution of the technology ecosystem that we're all in. I wonder if you can play that out. I mean, let's just step back to the pre-COVID session. Is most of us were doing
Mhm.
everything in person, right? I call it IRL or in real life. Meetings, advisory boards, everybody was flying to conferences, international meetings, clinical trial investigator meetings and audit. Everything was in person. Then we actually move forward and now we're completely in a virtual. I was wondering if you can kind of explain some of the platforms ideas, and as you know, just
Yeah.
Impetus, this is one of the things that Impetus does. But what was it like? What was that experience like of now doing these, theoretically, an advisory board online?
Mhm.
And then what's that next piece looking like? Is how is that going to look like? What does that mean by hybrid?
Yeah. Um, so our team was actually working with asynchronous, online engagement with Impetus before the pandemic. So I felt that that actually gave us a leg up. We did have to convince, depending on who the stakeholder was, if they um, were used to sort of using technology and engaging that way or not. But most did see the value in asynchronous engagement because they can do it on their own time. When you're talking about traveling to conferences, traveling to advisory board or investigator meetings, whatever it is, that takes up so much time. And as an MSL who was used to traveling, my days were filled with it. And I learned how to do things sort of on my phone, at an airport, in a hotel room, but that's not the ideal way to be working necessarily all the time. And so, having had that experience and then just being able to bring those tools into a pandemic setting where we were already familiar with it and the acceptance was there, we saw such a huge change in the readiness of all stakeholders to be able to engage digitally. And we were also felt a little bit like pioneers because we already knew how this worked. We were already experienced in doing things both, online, both asynchronously and live. And so that was really, I think, well received because it fit into their schedule with the asynchronous. They could do it whenever they wanted. They didn't have to disrupt clinic or anything like that to be able to participate. And then the live meetings, when you're joining a Zoom, it's just those 2 hours or however long it is. It's not the travel time and getting there and eating a meal and time away from your family and your clinic. And so I think as we move into this, post pandemic, this hybrid mode, I really hope we maintain that accessibility because, and that's something else I wanted to mention, it made these meetings and these engagements more equitable and more accessible because there are people who don't want to travel, aren't able to travel that amount. If we have stakeholders, especially within infectious disease, who might be immunocompromised in this setting, they don't want to travel. They maybe would prefer to be at home in a safer space for themselves. And so, my hope is that we maintain this sort of accessibility and this equity because now you can travel to a conference again, but conferences are making things available virtually. And so you can, instead of going to Frankfurt to attend a conference and disrupting your clinic for 2 weeks or being away from your family for 2 weeks, you can attend virtually and have maybe not the same experience, but the same access, a similar experience and the same access to the new information. And I think that's really important. We're democratizing information and we're making it more accessible. So that's what I hope for sort of the post crisis mode is that we maintain the hybrid engagement. We've all sort of had to have a crash course in IT in a way and how to run virtual and hybrid meetings. And it's not perfect, but we're learning as we go. And I'm really hopeful that we have this again a greater acceptance of alternate modes of communication and alternate modes of engagement to make healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry a little bit more accessible for all of our stakeholders.
Yeah, I love the word democratize. And I really especially like the whole idea. We hear a lot about diversity, inclusion, and equity, but I completely agree with you. There's just some people who can't, family situations, et cetera. And I'm not trying to generalize,
Yeah,
but oftentimes it is women and young women. And
100%.
we can now enable them to be right up there at the table as an investigator, as an advisor, and in so many other ways being able to participate. So I'm a big fan of that. And
Yeah.
again, being a woman run company as well. One thing I did want to inquire as well, which is really, you're sitting in an interesting position, Kaitlin, is, you're working for a smaller pharma company, but it is global, and you have colleagues from across the globe. You're attending these big international conferences. I'm curious as to how you plan or are, plan to, in your new role, collaborating with your global colleagues for big conferences, maybe perhaps using hybrid or online platforms for the collaboration, the planning, the sharing of data. What does that, or what could that look like?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I'm still sort of learning in this new role, so I don't have very detailed answers for you there, but it's back to some of the same themes that I was talking about when we're collaborating across the globe, having these digital solutions that, 2.5, 3 years ago we weren't even aware of. It's now a part of everyday business, not only working across continents or countries, but just with colleagues who could be across the street. I mean, our colleagues we do still have a head office in Montreal and they work the exact same way that I work from home. And so they have their, as I say, my Britney Spears headset, they have their Britney Spears headsets on, and they're in their virtual meetings, and they're collaborating on SharePoint, on Teams, all of these different digital tools. And so I think for preparing for congresses and showing up at congresses, this digital revolution is going to be essential moving forward. It's not going to change. And it also allows now, we used to send huge contingents to conferences. And so when we think about manpower and resources, environmental impact of that level of travel, everything, the fact that we can do things hybrid is really time saving, cost saving, better for the environment. And it does, as you were saying too, for people who don't have that accessibility, that ability to travel. I used to work a lot with dermatologists in my previous role, and dermatology is one of those specialties that maybe skews a little bit more female. And I cannot tell you how many young mothers who were also dermatologists who were just so happy at this transformation because they didn't have to sacrifice one for the other and were able to attend the conferences and able to engage with pharma, engage with industry, and not have to sacrifice on either one. And so I'm again, like, I think this transformation, for all of the disruption that the pandemic caused and all of the pain, and there is obviously a lot to be said for in real life interaction. I just keep coming back to this equity and this accessibility, and I hope that we're able to keep it moving forward.
And, another area that I think is so interesting, especially in your new role, because you're very involved with clinical trials. When we talk about equity, I'm also a really, really big fan and super excited about the inclusion of diverse populations, underrepresented populations, underserved, in this whole idea and area around
Mhm.
decentralized, and now with the idea of hybrid clinical trials, and especially intrigued and excited about new ways of doing patient-reported outcomes with interesting devices, ambient biometrics, looking at new endpoints. It's a very, very exciting space. And I was curious what your thoughts are around decentralized and hybrid. And number two, the integration of patients in clinical trial protocols and amendments, and really involving patients in a way we've never done before. And thirdly, how we're enveloping the entire clinical trial ecosystem, the investigators, the CROs, all the people in an environmental, in a digital platform that makes everything come together with fewer errors and fewer mistakes. So I was wondering if
Yeah,
you could talk about this from your perspective.
yeah. I am completely on board with the decentralization. I think we've operated the way that we've operated for many, many years because it's the way we've always done things, and we've seen innovation coming. And some industries and some companies and some stakeholders have been more ready to adopt innovation than others. And again, this disruption of this pandemic kind of forced innovation upon us. And so it's in a way been a really positive disruptor. So, in terms of decentralization and sort of being able to do remote monitoring visits for sites, a CRA doesn't have to take up a whole room in a clinician's office for a whole day to do monitoring necessarily every single time. If remote monitoring is a possibility, again, it frees up physical space and it frees up a lot of those restrictions that it would impose. The one caveat that I'll put sort of in all of this is, as long as we maintain integrity of the data and the quality of the data. Not that those things are inherently at risk, but whenever we're changing the way that we do things from a research perspective, we do need to, ensure that we're maintaining that integrity, because that's the whole point, right, of doing clinical trials and post marketing follow up and registries and all of those different things. It's the quality of the data and really evaluating the safety and efficacy of molecules in the population. So I'm all for decentralization. I think it's a wonderful tool. I know in the United States that um, EMR, electronic medical records, have been widely uptaken in the last, few decades. In Canada, we do still have a lot of investigators and a lot of clinicians still working in paper records. So I think there is still a need to push a little bit for the digitization and decentralization there that doesn't require sort of physical visits. Um, your second part was a little bit more about incorporating the patients. And I think this is such an important thing, having the patient voice be at the center of everything that we do, because we are healthcare companies and our patients should be at the forefront. They should be everything that we're working towards. It should be all about the patient. And so the patient should be at the center. And so, as much as we can incorporate that patient voice and that patient impact, I think you're going to build trust with communities because, warranted or not, there has been over past several decades some variability in the trust that the public has with pharmaceuticals. And so you build trust and you build advocacy. And at the end of the day, what we're doing is working towards better outcomes for our patients. And you can't work towards something for a stakeholder without having that stakeholder's voice be central in what you do. And I think that's something that sometimes we miss. We talk about stakeholders and we think about internal stakeholders and external stakeholders like KOLs and payers and the government. And we forget that the central stakeholder is actually the patient that's going to benefit from the medication. So 100% in line with you there as well. I think it's really important. And then your third point, I'm now blanking because I know there were three.
It was really about, it's about using the platforms for
Oh, yes.
doing all of this. How are you bringing everybody together and do this seamlessly?
I think it's a part that we haven't quite figured out yet. There are so many different technologies, right? If we talk about technologies for virtual communication, if we talk about EMR platforms and the way that different companies have tried to integrate video calls and virtual interactions into EMR platforms, or automated scheduling, integration of notes into patient charts, and all of these different things. And that's just from the sort of healthcare provider perspective. There have been a myriad of different solutions proposed, and they all have their different pros and cons, and they all have their different sort of limitations as well. So I think we're still in a bit of an infancy when it comes to figuring out how these digital tools can be made to work for us, simplify the processes and not overcomplicate them as well. And so when we speak about patient reported outcomes, PROs, there could be a really easy way. This is just an example from things I've been thinking about. If you have, say, an app that a patient can complete all of those assessments, and if it's just for patient reported outcomes, maybe you don't need to go into the physician's office, and that makes things easier for everyone. But that app, in terms of data privacy, where the data is stored, security, there are all of these complex layers that feed into that. And so I still think we're in our infancy, and we're working towards it, right? We're working towards how we integrate all of these digital virtual tools together. And I think there's some really amazing ideas. So I'm very excited for the future. I just think it's still at a stage where it's maybe a little too complex, and it's sometimes is overcomplicating and not simplifying in the way that we would like. And that
Absolutely.
also requires, sorry, a certain level of literacy in these digital technologies that not, again, everybody has. And then so it becomes an accessibility issue.
And I think my last question, because I could be asking you a million questions, honestly, I've got, we could probably be doing this for days. I have so many questions,
100%.
but one I think is really about real world evidence. We hear this all the time. It's part of our lingo. It's part of the
Hmm.
world. And some of us get it. Many of us, it's just a term. And the integration in market access,
Yeah.
reimbursement, accessibility to the average patient. Added on top of that, the additional layer, we've heard recently about the new bill that was signed in the US and the additional pricing pressures that are going to be applied. And this is not just a one and done. This is going to be an ongoing saga. and it's actually now been politicized. So with this ongoing pricing pressure and the need for real world evidence and, all sorts of new, outcomes-based agreements and on it goes, ultimately the idea around patients getting access to expensive drugs. Where does this play out? What's your thoughts about how do we do this in the most equitable way? And what is the smartest thing so that pharmaceutical companies are still profiting while at the same time allowing the appropriate patients who need these medications to get them?
Yeah, I think that's, I would say, $1 million question, but I mean, $1 million can't buy you a house where I live anymore. So it's more like the $1 trillion question. Yeah. It's such a good question, and it's such a complex thing. Real world evidence, it is, as you say, it's sort of, I hate to say a buzzword, but it became kind of a buzzword that, we want to incorporate real world evidence and incorporate patient voice and real patient experience. It is so essential. And I would love to see, as we see clinical trials become hopefully a little bit more decentralized, that we also realize that the historic clinical trial patient population that we have used in the past is quite archaic, not archaic, but it's quite limiting in a way. And if you look at clinical trial participation, sort of historically, as we see with many things, they tend to be predominantly white, predominantly male. And that does not reflect, the majority of human experience. And so we do need to have a little bit more of a real world lens, because at the end of the day, that's where the medicines will be used. And so from my perspective, there's a big push for sort of incorporating real world into clinical development even before access. And so it's a complicated issue, but I do see strides moving forward about providing access to patients who need it and collecting that real world data so that that can go towards the conversations with health authorities and payers about why access is important. Um, and my fundamental thing, having kind of come up in this industry in both HIV and immunology, is that no patient who needs a medicine should ever be unable to access it. And we have, our structures in place for a reason, and not to go around them, but providing care for me is the reason why I'm in this industry. I want to be here to help people who need medicine, who need treatment. And so when we talk about more affordable medicines, I mean, the world of medicine is vast. So we can talk from aspirin up to, life-saving biologics in the oncology space. Obviously, the development costs for those are going to be vastly different. So having affordable and easier access to medicines for more people should always be the goal. But for companies to be able to continue to innovate and be profitable, to further that innovation, there does have to be negotiations on those prices and an understanding, and maybe more transparency for people on how these negotiations happen and what the process looks like. Again, to sort of, I know that the pharmaceutical industry trust with society aspect has been tough at times. So maybe a little bit more transparency in how these processes work would be helpful. And so that we can have more open and honest conversations about clinical trial participation, populations, access to medicines, and pricing.
Love it. Kaitlin, so aspirational and inspirational. For anybody who's interested in connecting with Kaitlin on a numerous, interested in learning more about Theratechnologies, her mentorship, she does a lot of mentoring as well too, or just, if you're a female looking to get into the pharmaceutical industry, I'm sure Kaitlin would be very interested in chatting with you and numerous
100%.
other different topics. And I'm hoping we can get together again, Kaitlin. I have a million other questions to ask you. Such an interesting, there's so much to talk about. But for anybody who's also interested, check out impetusdigital.com. These are the kinds of things that we actually have interesting conversations asynchronously and synchronously. We create a series of touch points with our pharmaceutical clients, helping them to discover and uncover a lot of things about their brands. We work with payers being part of these discussions, patients, physicians, and numerous things. Also, if you're working with colleagues across the working and planning for conferences and ambassador programs, you're doing medical education, a whole slew of really interesting things, and even planning with what you're doing with your clinical trials, check out impetusdigital.com. We want to thank everybody for your time. Please like and subscribe to our channel. We'd also really appreciate if you can leave us some feedback on iTunes. Thank you, Kaitlin, for a very, very fascinating discussion, and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.